nearby land, there was a king. And this king was up in the very top of his castle. Now, you know how castles have these four big things that stand on the corners of them? Oh, he was all the way up in the tower, and he was looking out the window. And as he looked out the window, you could see the whole country. And he saw some things that should have made him really happy. You see, he saw these big, huge forests with giant trees, and he saw farmland that they could grow all kinds of crops. And there was this river that ran right through the middle of the city, and it was beautiful and crystal clear, and it was full of fish. Now, the king should have had this big smile on his face, but he didn't. He had a big frown. You see, he wasn't happy because there was this great sadness over the kingdom. You know, the worst thing of all, the people were not happy, but the worst thing was the children. He never even hardly heard them laugh. In fact, they were so sad and so afraid that sometimes a lot of them wouldn't even come out of their house to play. Now, the king was a good king, and he didn't want the people to be sad, so he decided to do something about it. So he called a meeting. Now, he had a big, huge castle, and he had a big, huge room, a whole lot bigger than this room. And he sent out a message, and he called for the people from the kingdom to come, and he called for the wise men, and the strong men, and the knights, and all these different people to come to this big meeting and to help him find out what was wrong in the kingdom. And so all these people gathered in the room just like they all are here, only it was a big, huge room, and it was full of people. And the king got up, and he started talking, and he told the people, he said, "There's a great sadness in our kingdom. You see, I was up in my tower, and I looked out, and I saw all these big trees growing all over the place. But there's some people in the kingdom that don't even have a house to live in. And I looked out, and I saw all this farmland, and it's just, we grow all kinds of crops all over the place, but there's some people in the kingdom that don't have any food to eat. And the worst thing of all is the children. I don't ever hear them laughing. They don't go out and play. We can't have this, because if it keeps going on this way, our kingdom's going to be destroyed." And so the king started asking for suggestions of what they could do. And somebody in the corner of the room called out, Your Majesty, what about if we sent out the royal knight? He could get on his horse with all his armor, and he could ride through the kingdom, and he could find out what was causing the sadness, and he could beat it up, and it'd go away." And the king said, "Already tried that. The knight rode out and went all over, and he couldn't defeat the sadness." And somebody else from the other side of the room called out, "Your Majesty, what about the royal wizard? What about if we sent him out, maybe somebody put an evil spell on the land, and that's why everybody's so sad. And he could go out and he could find out who was causing the problem, and he could make the spell go away and everybody would be happy." But the king said, "We already tried that too, and it didn't work." And you know, one idea after another. Somebody over here had an idea, and somebody over there had an idea, but every time somebody suggested something, the king said, "We already tried that." And while he was talking, his frown got bigger and bigger, because it seemed like nobody had an answer. But then, from way back in the very back of the room, where it was dark and shadows all the way to the back, a voice called out, "Your Majesty, Your Majesty." And everybody turned and looked. "I think I can solve your problem." Somebody could help solve the problem. Everybody turned and looked, and this man stepped out of the shadows, and he started walking up the middle of the room. And everybody wondered, who is he? You know, they thought maybe he's a knight, or maybe he's another wizard, or he's a really wise man, and he's going to come and he's going to help the king. But you know, instead of that, it just was a regular everyday guy. Except he had this big old sack over his shoulder, almost kind of like Santa Claus or something. And he came up the middle of the aisle, and right up to where the king was, and he took the sack and he put it down on the ground. And all everybody was looking at him. Who is he? What's in the sack? People thought, hey, he must be a magician or something. The king looked at the man and he said, how can you help? What's in that sack? You got magic in that sack? Something in that sack's going to save the kingdom? But you know, the man didn't answer the king about the sack. He just told the king, he said, I can help you, but you have to be willing to do exactly what I say. And the man leaned over real close to the king and almost touched his nose with the king. You got to do exactly what I say if you want to save the king. Now the king asked him, who are you? And the man said, I'm a weaver from down in the village. I make cloth. Well, all the crowd started. A weaver? What can he do? He's not a knight or a wise man or a rich man or got a whole bunch of education or anything. What can he do to save the kingdom? And everybody said, get him out of here. Get him out. There's nothing he can do. But the king, he stopped and he said, now wait a minute. We've already tried all these other things and they didn't work, so let's give him a chance. And so the king asked him, what do you want us to do? And the man said, everybody in the kingdom, everybody, if they can walk, it doesn't matter how young or how old or anything, they need to gather up outside of the castle tomorrow. Get everybody in the whole land gathered up outside the castle, and I'll tell what they have to do. The king sent out messengers all over and said, for all the people to come. And so the next morning, everybody that lived in the kingdom, young people, old people, little people, big people, everybody, all over, they all came, and there was this big, huge crowd gathered outside the castle. And they were all waiting for the man to come. And the king stood there, and after a couple minutes, somebody said, here he comes! And everybody looked, and they made a way for him to walk, and he came up the street, and he had that big old sack on his back. And he came right up to the king, and he set the sack down again. The king looked around, all the people, and he looked at the man, and he said, now tell me, is there magic in that sack? Is there something in that sack that's going to save our kingdom? The man stood for a minute, and then he turned to the king, and he looked at him, and he looked at the people, and then he reached down in the sack. Now, everybody gathered in really close because they wanted to know what was in the sack. You know, they expected maybe he'd pull out a magic wand or something and out of the sack. But instead, he pulled out the end of this big, bright, red ribbon. And he held it up real high. Oh, it's a magic ribbon! He's got magic ribbon in that sack. Everybody, oh, there's magic ribbon. And the man told the king, he said, now here's what must be done. This ribbon has to stretch all across the whole land. It's got to go down all the streets, through the alleys, across the bridges, up over the mountains, across the rivers, all till it stretches all the way to the end of the land, and every single person has to help. And the most important part of all, the ribbon must never touch the ground. If the ribbon touches the ground, then the magic won't work. Now, all the little children had gathered up to the front of the crowd like y'all are. They had squeezed in between legs and they got up there. And the man, the weaver, he took the end of that ribbon and he handed it to a little girl in her hand, and he motioned for her to start walking down the street. And she took the ribbon and she started walking, and the ribbon was pulling out of the bag. And what do you think was going to happen? The ribbon was pulled out of the bag, and when it pulled out of the bag, it started sagging down, and it almost touched the ground. And the weaver said, "Stop!" And the little girl stopped, and she looked back. Oh no, the ribbon was going to touch the ground. And what did the weaver say? If the ribbon touches the ground, the magic won't work. And everybody was just kind of paralyzed. They were standing there. What were they going to do? And then, without anybody telling him, a little boy came out of the crowd, and he walked up, and he reached down, and he put his hand right under the ribbon, and took it, and held it high up over his head. And then he and the little girl started walking down the street. And every time the ribbon would pull out of the sack and it would almost touch the ground, another little boy or girl would come out, and they'd take the ribbon and they'd hold it up. And then after all the children had had the ribbon, then the grown-ups started coming out. There was a doctor and a policeman and a mailman and a school teacher and the man who collected the trash, and all the people one at a time. They came out, and as the ribbon would pull out and almost touch the ground, they'd take it and they'd hold it high over their head. And you know that ribbon started stretching all down all the streets. Can you imagine in your town, all the streets, this ribbon stretching down the streets, in between the houses and across the bridges and over the mountains and the forest, and it just kept going and going until every single person that lived in the whole country was holding the ribbon, and it was stretched all the way across the land. And the king was standing there, and he looked out, and he could see that ribbon and all those people. He turned to the weaver and he said, "When does the magic start?" And the weaver said, "It's already started." And he took the king's arm, and they started walking down the line of people. And they walked behind him, and they walked a little ways, and they stopped behind two people. Now one of them was a really nice, well-dressed man. He had the nicest clothes on. And he was standing there holding the ribbon, and standing right next to him was a little girl. And she had on a dress that was all thin and had some holes in it and was kind of ragged, and she didn't even have any shoes on. And she stood there and she held the ribbon, and she was cold. She was shaking because it was early morning, and it was like this morning it was cold when you came out of your house. And the man was standing there, and he looked over at the little girl and he said, "Where's your coat, little girl? What are you doing out on a day like today with no coat?" And she just, "I don't have one." "Don't have a coat? What? That's ridiculous. Everybody should have a coat. Myself, I have dozens of coats. You see, I'm the town tailor, and I make coats for a living. I make big coats and little coats and long coats and short coats and red coats and all kinds of coats. Now, you don't have a coat? Well, that's ridiculous." And he thought a minute, and then he said, "I'll tell you what we'll do. When we finish here, you come with me to my shop, and I'll find a coat that fits you. And if I can't find one, I'll measure you, and I'll make you a coat." Now the king standing there, and he heard this, and he thought it sounded pretty good. Because one of the things that had been happening in his country was nobody hardly ever talked to each other, and now these people were talking, and his frown, it looked a little bit less. And then the weaver took his arm, and they went a little further down the road, and they stopped behind two more people. Now, one of them was a lady, and she was nice and big and round, and had a white apron on, and a tall white hat. And standing next to her was this old man, and he was kind of like this, kind of old looking and weak and bent over. And the lady said, "What is that terrible noise?" And the old man said, "Oh, I'm sorry. That must have been my stomach. I didn't mean to scare you. I haven't eaten today, and I guess I'm a little hungry." "Why, you don't look like you've eaten in a long time." "Well, I didn't eat yesterday either." "What, 2 days with no food?" "I can hardly go 2 minutes." And it shows, too. You see, I'm the town baker, and I make all kinds of good stuff. I make the best breads and cakes and cookies and all kinds of stuff. If you haven't eaten, why haven't you come to my shop and bought some food? "Well, as I don't have any money. See, I don't have a job, and I don't have any way of getting money to buy food." Well, that woman took her hat off and scratched her head, and she thought, and she said, "No money to buy food? Why, that won't do. Nobody should go hungry." She thought a minute more, and she said, "I tell you what, when we're finished here, you come with me to my place, and here's what we'll do. I'll give you some of my best cakes, breads, cookies, and we'll get you all strong again. And then you take my stuff, my breads and cakes and cookies and all that, and you take them out into the village and go door to door, and you sell them for me, and then you bring me the money back, and I'll give you a fair wage and more food to eat." Now, the king was listening, and he thought, this sounded pretty good. Both of their problems were going to be solved. And you know, his frown now was almost completely gone. His mouth was straight across. He wasn't quite as sad. And so the weaver and the king started down the road one more time. And they went a little ways, and they came to the river, and they stopped behind two men. Now, these men were big and strong, and they were standing there, and they were holding that ribbon. One of them was standing there holding the ribbon this way, and the other one was standing there holding the ribbon this way, and they wouldn't even look at each other. Because you see, they came from opposite sides of the river, and they were the same color, and they thought, we don't have anything to talk about. And so they just stood there, but you know, neither one of them wanted to be there. But they certainly weren't going to be the one to drop the ribbon and leave, because you remember what would happen if the ribbon touched the ground. He didn't want to be said, he let the ribbon touch the ground. So they just stood there and ignored each other for a while. But did you ever try to go a long, long time without talking? Not very easy, is it? And these men thought, gosh, we could be here a long time. And it started getting kind of boring. So finally, one of the men turned to the other man and said, don't you have the farm on the other side of the river? The man said, yes. He said, you grow the best crops in the whole country. You got watermelons, it takes 2 people to carry them. And cantaloupes this big around. I can't get anything to grow on my side of the river. The other man said, well, yes, don't you have all those trees and all that on your side of the river? And the man said, yes, I have lots of trees. I grow trees and cutting them down for a living. And the farmer said, well, you know, I don't have any trees on my side of the river. I sure could use some more barns. I sure would like to have some of those trees. And the man with the trees said, you know, I sure would like to learn how to grow crops like you do, so I could have some good food. You know, I was just wondering, maybe I could pay you to show me how to grow them. And the farmer said, well, look, tell you what I'll do. I'll come over. If you'll give me some trees, I'll show you how to grow the crops. The other man said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll bring some trees over to you. And the farmer said, well, I'll go one better than that. I'll not only show you how to grow the crops, I'll come over and help you plant them. And the man with the trees said, well, I'll go one better than that. I'll not only bring the trees over, I'll help you build some barns. And the two men started talking. And you know what they found out? They found out they had a whole lot of things in common. It was almost like magic. Here were these two men standing there holding this ribbon who thought because they were different colors and because they lived on opposite sides of the river that they didn't have one single thing to talk about. And they found out that they were more alike than they were different. And when the king heard this, boy, his frown was completely gone and he had a big smile. This was just the kind of thing he was looking for. The kingdom was going to be saved. And so him and the weaver, they started walking back up to the castle. And the king was happy, and they got almost up to the castle. And he turned to the weaver and he said, tell me, where did you get that magic ribbon? But before the weaver could answer, the king noticed the sack. And the wind started blowing like it was this morning. And the end of the ribbon came out of the sack and started floating up in the air. And the king thought, as soon as the wind stops blowing, the ribbon's going to fall down and touch the ground. And what had happened? The magic broken. And the king didn't want that. So he looked around for somebody to order, go grab that ribbon. But everybody else was already holding the ribbon. And he turned to say something to the weaver, and the weaver was gone. And the king realized he was going to have to get the ribbon. But the ribbon was over there, and he was over here, and he was a short little guy with short little legs. And he had a long way, and he started running as fast as he could. With his long legs going, and the ribbon started falling, and he jumped, and he grabbed it. Missed. And the ribbon came down and touched the ground. And the king fell down on his knees, and this big tear started coming down his face. Because all the happy stuff that would happen, the weaver said if the ribbon touches the ground, no more magic. Then this really strange thing started happening. He could still hear the people talking. And he could still hear them laughing. And he could hear the children playing and having fun. And he stood up and he held the ribbon in his hand. And then suddenly he realized hadn't been a magic ribbon. The weaver wasn't a magician. The magic wasn't in that ribbon that those people were holding. He realized the magic of the people